Washington, D.C., Monday, 22 October 1962, 7 o'clock Eastern Time. The President of the United States, John F. Kennedy, Democrat of Massachusetts, informs the nation in a nationally televised Oval Office address that the armed forces of the Soviet Union are actively engaged in the installation of medium-range ballistic nuclear missiles on the island of Cuba. Missiles which, should they become operational, could potentially wipe out virtually any city in the Western Hemisphere within a matter of hours. Now, there are certain snippets of the speech, 4 or 5 sentences probably, that everybody has heard 1,000 times before because they're practically obligatory when you're doing a documentary on JFK or the 60s or presidential history or any number of things. And one of those is right at the beginning of the speech when he states that indisputable evidence exists for the missiles being there. And the other one is nearer to the end, the part where he says any missile launched from Cuba against any country in our hemisphere will be deemed an attack by the Soviet Union upon the United States. And we will then promptly respond by nuking you vodka-swilling bastards right back to the Stone Age. But there are parts of the speech that you never hear, but which I think are instructive for current-day purposes, and not just because of the pro-democracy demonstrations in Cuba right now, but because as you're listening to this excerpt from JFK as I read it, try to imagine a Democrat president in the 21st century talking this way. And then afterward, we'll talk about why they can't and why they don't. And no, I'm not doing the entire thing in a JFK voice, no matter how bad you want me to, Mr. Speaker. Quote, "Finally, I want to say a few words to the captive people of Cuba, to whom this speech is being directly carried by special radio facilities. I speak to you as a friend, as one who knows of your deep attachment to your fatherland, as one who shares your aspirations for liberty and justice for all. And I have watched, and the American people have watched with deep sorrow, how your nationalist revolution was betrayed, and how your fatherland fell under foreign domination." And let's pause here for a brief parenthetical, because for those who don't know, what he's talking about here is the fact that Fidel Castro swore up and down for years that he was not a communist. He told anybody who would listen that he couldn't stand communism. He went on U.S. network news programs and guaranteed the American people that he wasn't a communist. And he kept saying that right up until he gained power and the Soviets started dangling free goodies in front of his face and offering his regime the geopolitical relevance that he so fervently sought for it. And then, of course, he became an enthusiastic communist within about 5 minutes. But the Cuban Revolution, when it was being fought, was not a communist revolution, and a lot of the ordinary, everyday people who participated in it would not have done so if they'd known they were fighting to live under 60-plus years of Marxist repression. It was a populist revolution whose stated aims were to get rid of a corrupt autocratic ruler. But the Cuban people got hoodwinked in the end when Fidel took his mask off and they realized all they had done is swap out one corrupt autocrat for another. But back to JFK. Quote again. "Now your leaders are no longer Cuban leaders inspired by Cuban ideals. They are puppets and agents of an international conspiracy which has turned Cuba against your friends and neighbors in the Americas and turned it into the first Latin American country to become a target for nuclear war, the first Latin American country to have these weapons on its soil. These new weapons are not in your interest. They contribute nothing to your peace and well-being. They can only undermine it. But this country has no wish to cause you to suffer or to impose any system on you. We know that your lives and land are being used as pawns by those who deny your freedom. Many times in the past, the Cuban people have risen to throw tyrants out who destroyed their liberty. And I have no doubt that most Cubans today look forward to the time when they will be truly free. Free from foreign domination, free to choose their own leaders, free to select their own system, free to own their own land, free to speak and write and worship without fear or degradation. And then shall Cuba be welcomed back to the Society of Free Nations and the associations of this hemisphere." End quote. The most potent weapon that any United States president has at his disposal when he is toiling in the vineyard of international political brinkmanship is the moral authority of the United States. And we possess that moral authority because we have done more to advance the twin causes of human freedom and self-government than all other nation states that have ever existed put together, and we have got the body count to damn well prove it. But a president cannot wield that moral authority when he and the idiots in his administration purport not to even believe in its existence. Because you can't credibly express empathy for people who are trying to gain the right of free speech when you and Mark Zuckerberg have got your hands down each other's jeans trying to censor the opponents of the regime on social media. You can't commiserate with people who are seeking democratic self-government when your party would very much like to rig all of the country's elections so they can never lose again. And you can't wield the moral authority of the United States of America, which again was fairly purchased with the blood of our sons and daughters, when you and the retards in your administration are falling all over each other every day proclaiming America the world's foremost evildoer. And remind me again, what country's flag do oppressed people always wave when they are yearning to breathe free? Because I'm pretty sure it ain't the rainbow flag, or the BLM flag, or that other flag that looks like someone sneezed a bunch of earth tones all over a rainbow flag and tried to wipe it off with a napkin. I think that one's called the equality flag or something. And yeah, that's really a stupendous achievement in the field of vexillology. No, Jim Eagle, I'm not going to tell you what that word means, because you should be able to infer its meaning from the manner in which it was used. Which Ivy League school did you graduate from again? From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where even the filthy little street urchins who eat their own head lice to survive know what vexillology is, because we are all about public literacy around here after all. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America, and all ships at sea. And hello to you as well, Mr. and Mrs. Havana, if you're listening in on Radio Free Curmudgeon from the comfort of your brand new improvised watercraft. Welcome to the program. I am your eponymous host and humble servant. And I want to talk a little bit more about vexillology, because at this point I'm fairly determined that this is going to be the first video in YouTube history in which the word vexillology appears 5 times. Vexillology. Make it 6 times. Because if there's any reason why people have traditionally enjoyed watching the Olympics on television for the past 50 years or so, it has a hell of a lot to do with flags. In fact, it has more to do with flags and with nationalism than it does with athletic competition. Now, Americans don't pretend to care about obscure track and field sports for 5 minutes every 4 years because they enjoy watching the discus or the javelin or the hammer throw. They watch it because they enjoy the moment when an American athlete wins gold and then has a nice big blubbery cry up there on the medal stand as they try to correctly mouth the lyrics for the national anthem. And even when the American athlete doesn't win, when there's some shocking upset and a barefoot goat herder from Peru improbably wins the gold, it's just as much fun watching that guy blubber and sing. Not because you care about the sport he plays or the event he's in, but because it's fun to watch the fruits of meritocracy. Because it's rewarding to see people elevate themselves to the pinnacle of their profession on the world's biggest stage. And it's more rewarding when that person's greatest source of pride is not the victory they just won in the athletic arena, but rather the idea that they have done right by their homeland and made their countrymen proud. But you don't get much of that when you're sending athletes to the Olympics who are avowedly ashamed of the country in which they live and which they represent, who take umbrage at the display of their national flag, and when you're the president of that country, and pro-democracy demonstrators in another country are waving your flag as a symbol of their yearning for liberty and self-government and the end of communist tyranny, then doesn't it make you look like kind of a dope when you treat that same flag like it's an embarrassment? When you instruct our embassies overseas to fly the flags of Marxist domestic terror groups instead of the national flag, when there are more U.S. flags to be found on the surface of the moon than there are at DNC headquarters. Even if there was a situation wherein he really, really needed to, the current president could not wield American moral authority as a rhetorical weapon against our enemies because he and his administration have made it abundantly clear, just in their first 6 months, that they do not believe such moral authority exists. And it can't help but make one wonder what President John Kennedy might have thought about the antics of President Joe Biden. But let's get back to the Olympics, because I'm sure your excitement level is running at a fever pitch just like mine is. I guess that probably wasn't the best term to use. I mean, anyway, you're probably excited as the folks at Toyota, because what's more exciting than having the Olympic Games come to the country where you're the biggest car company and one of the biggest companies, period. I bet Toyota is going to blanket this thing wall to wall. You probably won't even be able to bang that Danish high jumper you just met without having to unwrap a Toyota branded condom. Wait, what? I'm getting word from our in-house fact checker that Toyota has pulled all their advertising from the entire Olympics, which are in Tokyo? And what else? Everyone's going to have to mask and social distance, so they can't even have random anonymous sex with people from countries they've never heard of. Isn't that at least half the fun of making the country's Olympic team in the first place? I feel like you guys are messing with me back there. What are you going to tell me next? That all the events are going to take place in empty venues? Oh, what? God, that too? But wasn't the whole point of delaying the Olympics for an entire year so that they wouldn't have to take place in empty venues with masks and social distancing? How did that work out? So, I guess, welcome to the Kung Flu Transgender Empty Venue 2020 Summer Olympics, which are really happening in 2021, proudly sponsored by some company that is not Toyota. But I think they're really striking a blow for inclusivity and social justice here by allowing weightlifters with big swinging dicks to compete in the female division, which, by my count, hasn't happened since the East German women's team disbanded around 1990, taking with them their world-class training regimen consisting of 24-hour IV drips of HGH and nandrolone, and which in later years became the training regimen for Mark McGuire and Barry Bonds. I guess what I'm getting at is, why do the Olympics still exist? Do they create any real benefit for anyone who is not on the payroll of the IOC or one of the National Olympic Committees? Have the Olympics become just another permanently entrenched bureaucracy that keeps spiraling downward, keeps getting less and less useful, but everybody just goes through the motions every 4 years from sheer force of habit? Now, despite the orgies of spending that cities engage in trying to attract the Olympics, they always wind up being a disastrous thing for the host city and often the host country by extension. I think the LA Olympics in '84 were the last ones that created a profit for the place that held them. And as we've gotten farther into the 21st century, it seems like the legacy of Olympic hosting is always a bunch of abandoned, dilapidated venues and a mountain of public debt that takes decades to pay off. I think Montreal still hasn't paid off its debt from hosting the '76 Olympics. And Athens, hosting the games in 2004 wrecked their entire national economy, and they still haven't recovered from it. They still can't even afford to tear down the derelict venues that are still sitting there. So Athens is now home to two distinct varieties of ruins, those from the era of the ancient Olympics and those from the 2004 Olympics. But that abandoned baseball stadium, it's not going to make nearly as pleasing a ruin as the Parthenon. I'm just saying. I can almost picture some befuddled future archaeologist saying, "Why the hell would Greeks be playing baseball?" And you know what else has made the Olympics significantly less compelling? Professionalism. I mean, yeah, as a one-time novelty, the Dream Team was really cool back in '92, but what has happened since then? NBA players don't treat being selected for the Olympic team as any sort of honor. They treat it as something between a chore and an annoyance. Many of those who are selected declined to participate because there's no money in it. Hey, what, do you want me to risk injury just to represent a country I hate? So we wind up sending basically an NBA all-star B team full of names that no casual viewer knows or cares about, and even more so now because the NBA is less culturally relevant today in 2021 than it has been at any point since the pre-Bird and Magic era when the NBA Finals were being shown on tape delay. And worse yet, today's NBA players represent a league that has made anti-Americanism one of the foundation stones of its marketing identity, a league that will take disciplinary action against you for criticizing the Chinese Communist Party but will give you a high five and a pat on the back for saying a police officer should be murdered or that the President of the United States is a bad orange man. So, while people in Cuba take to the streets and wave the U.S. flag, knowing that to do so is a crime in itself, and any criticism of the regime is a crime in itself, just as it's starting to be in this country, to be honest. But ultimately, you know what those Cubans are doing? They are waving the U.S. flag for the same reason our founding fathers waved it, as an expression of their desire to throw off the yoke of tyranny and institute the right of self-government that is automatically conferred on every man and woman by virtue of his or her birth. And what a contrast that is, when in the United States, our wealthy elite classes, the people who have benefited the most from our form of government, they're the ones who love to play act at being socialists and communists. They've all got at least 2 Che Guevara t-shirts in their walk-in closet of their 4,000 square foot McMansion in their tasteful suburb with good schools and great yoga studios. And when they see a U.S. flag, or worse yet, a U.S. flag being flown from a pickup truck, they instinctively recoil in horror, pull over to the side of the road, and make a 3-minute-long TikTok video about how scarred and traumatized they are because, oh my God, I just saw a white supremacist. Meanwhile, the people who have a real and fully formed understanding of what the U.S. flag actually represents are the people who live in the communist dictatorship, who have suffered for over 6 decades now under the boot of a tyranny that was imposed upon them by means of deception, to which some of them gave their approval or even their participation or sometimes their lives on a false pretense. Because it really is ironic when you look at Cuba from the dispassionate 30,000-foot historian's view, considering the last 60, 70, 80, 100 years of that island's history, that they should be waving the U.S. flag as an expression of the yearning for freedom when the Castro Revolution, as it was presented to the Cuban people and the world at the time, was supposed to be about ridding Cuba of morally corrupt influences from the United States, specifically gambling and organized crime, which of course were often largely one and the same. But Castro's whole rationale, and it would have been correct if he hadn't been lying, was that the former dictator, Batista, he just hangs out in Florida most of the time, and when he pops in to see us, it's just to do some roundups or to execute somebody. And it's often being done at the behest of American organized crime figures. And because of this, we need to rid our island of all U.S. influences and install a system of self-government that is controlled by the Cuban people. And it was a great sales pitch, because it was based on grievances that were true and valid. But as the Cubans found out all too soon, it was just communism in a freedom-colored suit. And all things considered, the current regime, La Revolución, has not been an upgrade over the strongman dictator who was a stooge for the U.S. mob. The only real difference has been that different people wind up getting imprisoned and killed for different reasons when the ordinary man and woman on the street still want nothing much more than they've ever wanted or that decent people everywhere want, which is to be able to live their lives in peace, to look after their families, maybe to own a bit of land, and to say what's on their mind without the risk of arrest and incarceration. And yeah, the people who run our government, they may be ashamed of our flag. Our Olympic prima donna athletes in the empty venues in Tokyo may be ashamed of our flag. But from where your host is sitting, as long as our flag is the one being waved by the people who are actively engaged in the same fight that our ancestors were fighting when that flag was first created, then I am happy to leave it to the judgment of the people in Havana and Hong Kong and Taiwan and elsewhere to decide what it is that Old Glory really stands for. See you Wednesday. Get off my lawn.